Hello, my name is Jason DeMora, and welcome back to By Faith Bible Studies. Firstly, you'll notice that I wasn't here last week. Basically, I got my wisdom teeth removed that last week around that time, and so I was out of it. Also, you didn't want to see bloated Jason on camera. It was quite terrifying. Secondly, you'll notice that the board game wall is not behind us because I am short some equipment this week. So I'm actually in Timmy's studio today, which is super cool. Timmy is watching and recording this right now, so it's kind of cool to be there and be in this environment. So I'm actually using an LSB Bible this time to all those LSB supporters because he has an LSB Bible. And that's the one he's using. He wouldn't let me use any other Bible saying they were less holy or whatever. None of that's true of course. But, all right, so let's jump into the section. We're going into Proverbs 5. And Proverbs 5 is an interesting chapter because Proverbs 5 through 7 send us into a new section in Proverbs. As I talked about when we looked at Proverbs 1, Proverbs 1 through 4 is a plea from a father to a son to pursue wisdom. And it is this calling to his son that wisdom is worthy. Wisdom is full of riches. In chapter 1, we saw this bold introduction that wisdom is truth and that wisdom offers these riches. Chapter 2, we went deeper into those riches, looking at the treasures of wisdom. And chapter 3 really did a similar thing. And in the middle of chapter 3, we got that beautiful verse that says, God founded the world by wisdom. God sustains the world by wisdom. And that wisdom he gives to us as a glimpse. However, we are reminded that the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. Then in chapter 4, we once again looked at the riches of wisdom and how wonderful wisdom is. And this chapter was an interesting chapter because we took some time to look at the generational aspect of wisdom and that David taught Solomon wisdom. Solomon's taught Rehoboam wisdom. And Rehoboam did not teach his sons wisdom, and so the kingdom fell. And that wisdom, the Christian religion, is in a way a generational religion. Although salvation is by faith and faith alone, that faith should be shared from one generation to the next. That's why we have the scriptures today, is because it was passed on. But now we enter a new section. And this new section is still a plea from a father to his son. But rather than pursuing wisdom, it is to run from adultery. To run from adultery. And 3 whole chapters are spent on the topic of adultery. And so we have to ask a question of why does Solomon spend so many chapters on adultery? So I'm going to ask a set of questions and then hope to answer them for you guys about why studying adultery is so important. The first question that we have to ask is a reminder of who is the writer and when did he write this? This is Solomon, as we've talked about, and it is a pre-fall Solomon. What I mean by this is that Proverbs 5 through 7 is written before 1 Kings 11, 1 through 8. 1 Kings 11, 1 through 8 reads, Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women, from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the sons of Israel, You shall not go along with them, nor shall they go along with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. He committed adultery. Now it happened at the time that Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to Yahweh his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and did not follow Yahweh fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountains which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Now Yahweh was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so here we see this odd realization that the person who wrote Proverbs, especially Proverbs 5 through 7, fell short. And I think this is important to note, especially because after this, Proverbs 5 through 7 is written, then the account of 1 Kings 11, 1 through 8 happens. Then we have a sort of repentance on Solomon's part. And we saw this in Ecclesiastes. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes real quick. In Ecclesiastes 7, 25 through 29, it reads this. Let me get that right. Ecclesiastes 7:25-29. I turned my heart to know, to explore, and to seek wisdom, and an explanation, and to know the wickedness of foolishness, and the simple-minded folly of madness. And I found more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are chains. One who is good before God will escape her, but the sinner will be captured by her. See, I have found this, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find an explanation, which my soul still seeks but has not found. I have found one man out of 1,000, but I have not found a woman among all these. See, I have found only this, that God made men upright, but they have sought out many devices. And thus, in an interesting way, Solomon's life serves as one who said, do not follow adultery, but also one who committed adultery and repented of it. And so to look at that full story, I think is very interesting and powerful as we jump into this. The next question we have to ask is, why are there 3 chapters? Why so much about adultery? Well, as we've seen, repetition plays a very important part in the Bible, and it shows us that it's important. Adultery is very important, and God abhors adultery, and that is why there are 3 chapters about it. Also, if we look at what happened to Solomon, that even though he wrote these 3 chapters, he fell into the sin. And what 3 chapters shows us is how easy it is to fall into the sin of adultery and how much instruction we need to fight against this particular sin. The next question I want to ask is, what's the flow of these 3 chapters? Because they obviously can't all be talking about the same thing. That wouldn't be very interesting. The first chapter, the chapter we're going to be talking about today, is talking about fleeing adultery. It's very basic, very simple, run from adultery. Very specifically talking about adultery. Then Proverbs 6 goes in another direction and talks to the young man and shows how his life would lead towards adultery. He speaks about a lazy, lustful young man who would lead to becoming an adulterer. And then if the picture is not clear enough, Proverbs 7 comes in as the boldest call against adultery in this graphic depiction through this drama. There's literally almost a play going on in Proverbs 7 where adultery is blatantly shown as this evilness. And so thus we have almost bookended on both sides. Flee adultery and don't become an adulterer in the middle. The next question I want to ask is, why should I study this? I mean, why should we study adultery, especially someone young like me? I'm not even married. I'm not in that position, it seems like. Well, the first of all and foremost is adultery is a sin, and you shouldn't commit it. And I think warning against any sin is super important. But we do have to look at a cross-reference real quick. In Matthew 5, one sec. I don't have this one bookmarked, so it's going to take me a hot moment. Matthew 5:27-30, Jesus says something very interesting about adultery. And he says this in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. But if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. For it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. And so in this, we see that Jesus, first of all, treats adultery very seriously. Then he says this, that all lust is, in a sense, adultery. Now, I want to make it very clear, these chapters are not, especially Proverbs 5. Proverbs 6 begins to talk about lust, but Proverbs 5 is not talking about not talking about lust. It's talking about adultery. But to make that connection is important. And it shows us really that adultery is sort of the epitome of sexual morality, of lust. The other thing that I do want to point out here is maybe you're not struggling with this sin. Maybe you're not struggling with lust. Maybe you're not struggling with adultery. Well, first and foremost, I'll say I think this is a very important passage for me to study and for all young men. I think Solomon is talking to the right audience because I will be honest, it is a sin I am struggling with, not adultery, but lust. And it is one that I would argue, and Solomon would argue, that most young men struggle with. and young women as well. And I think it is a powerful sin, especially in our society. However, maybe that's not you. Well, Matthew 26:41 counters that by saying something that I think is very important. Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Adultery is an easy sin to commit to the mind that is unprepared for these things. May we prepare our minds so that we may be able to fight against adultery, and may we be able to resist the calls of lust. Lastly, and I think this is an important question, is how can we have a right understanding of adultery in our present culture, a culture that I'll label the sexual revolution? See, what I mean by this is, according to our world, lust, adultery, it's just another pleasure, another whims of the life, another whims of those sexual passions allowing them to run free. Adultery isn't really a big deal. I mean, there's premarital sex as its replacement, and divorce follows after if it does happen. It's not a big deal according to our society. But if we look at the context of when Solomon wrote this, we can see how important adultery was and how huge of a deal it is. In the Old Testament, we have the most obvious, Exodus 20:14, "You shall not commit adultery." But why? Well, first of all, it obviously is a command from God that is to follow. But the Old Testament doesn't leave it there. Leviticus 20:10 says this: "If there is a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death." This is repeated in Deuteronomy 22:22. "If a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the women. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel." There is death, temporal death online for the adulterer. Maybe not in our current society nearly as much, but it still is something to consider, and it is a reality. And in that culture, it was a huge thing. You committed adultery, you would be killed. But maybe that's not a threat. Well, let me turn to the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 6:9 says this about adultery. 1 Corinthians 6:9. "Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor adulterers, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." And included in there is adultery. What I mean by this is the Old Testament shows us that there is a temporal death that comes to adulterers according to the culture. But across all cultures, across all times, there is eternal damnation at stake, eternal death to those who commit adultery. It doesn't matter if the sexual passions of our time are allowed. It doesn't matter if divorce rates are rising and premarital sex is allowed. It doesn't matter. Still, God's law does not change, and eternal damnation is on stake. Adultery is important. And under this subheading, we have to ask the question of, why is adultery so evil? Why does God see this as such a huge thing? Well, let's turn to the beginning. Genesis 2:24 says this: "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." This is the institution of marriage. And in reference to this marriage, Ephesians 5 has something very interesting to say. Ephesians 5:31-32 quotes this very verse. It says in verse 31, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Then here's the very interesting commentary. "This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church." So adultery is a breaking of that beautiful image. When we talked about Proverbs 2, I talked about this a little bit. This idea that adultery is a form of idolatry, an idolatry of the wrong flesh, of going against this sort of metaphor that God has created, that there is a relationship between the Christ and the church that is symbolized in the marriage between one man and one woman. And when you break that, you are in a sense committing adultery against God in breaking that, and you are also committing idolatry by not living for God. He takes this very seriously. Now, I want to make this disclaimer again very clear. This text is not specifically talking about idolatry. It's not specifically talking about lust. It's talking about adultery. The reason I want to make that clear is because I don't want you guys to be focusing on those things and forget how necessary running away from adultery is. It still should be considered as a very dangerous sin. However, adultery is the outcome of lust and a type of idolatry, one that God abhors greatly. Yes, maybe adultery was more common back then because marriage was more common, but it's still a huge thing. And when we take it in consideration that lust leads to adultery and is a form of adultery, this text can be taken seriously, as adultery is sort of the epitome of sexual immorality. Now that we've answered these questions, I think we are able to now jump into the text. Proverbs 5. Let me turn there real quick. Proverbs 5. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Incline your ear to my discernment, that you may keep discretion and that your lips may guard knowledge. For the lips of a strange woman drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold of Sheol. Lest she watch the path of life, her tracks are unstable, she does not know it. So now, my sons, listen to me and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your splendor to others and your years to the cruel one. Let strangers be satisfied by your strength and by your painful labor, those in the house of a foreigner, and you groan at your end when your flesh and your body are consumed, and you say, how I have heard discipline, and my heart spurned reproof. My apologies. How I have hated discipline, and my heart spurned reproof. I have not listened to the voice of my instructors, and I have not inclined my ear to my teachers. I was almost in utter ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. Drink water from your own cistern, and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for you alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and be glad in the wife of your youth. As a loving hind in a graceful doe, let her breasts satisfy you at all times, be intoxicated always with her love. So why should you, my son, be intoxicated with the strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a foreign woman? For the ways of a man are before the eyes of Yahweh, and he watches all his tracks. His own iniquities will capture him, who is the wicked one. And with the cords of his sin he will be held fast. He will die for lack of discipline, and the abundance of his folly he will stumble in intoxication. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I pray that as we look at this sin of adultery that you have made so clear, it is an abhorrence in your eyes. Lord, that we would run away from adultery and run towards you, Lord. That we would understand how serious this is and how much we need to fight this particular sin. And not be afraid to talk about it, not be afraid to think that it wouldn't be a sin we wouldn't commit, but to rather fear you. Amen. I'm going to be looking at this section in 3 parts, and I don't think each of these sections are very well connected. I think there are 3 different sort of stories that connect through their 3 different stories. So I'm going to call them vignettes. It's a fun word. I learned this new word. It's great. Our first vignette will be verses 1 through 6, and this is, I'm going to title, Poisoned Honey. Poisoned Honey. It says here, my son, pay attention to my wisdom, incline your ear to my discernment, that you may keep discretion and your lips may guard knowledge. What a familiar saying. I mean, we saw this multiple times in chapter 4. We saw it in chapter 3, chapter 2, and chapter 1. Either starting or somewhere in each chapter, there is a call from the Father to the Son. Pay attention to wisdom. It is a repetition of this call because the Father cares so deeply for his Son, and he hopes that his Son will hear these words because they are so important. But there is a choice diction in these 2 verses that I think is very well done, really from a poetic lens, but also obviously from a biblical one and from the message that comes out of it. It says, and that your lips may guard your knowledge, for the lips of a strange woman drip honey. He compares the lips of knowledge, and that if your lips are full of knowledge, you will be free and be able to evade the lips of the strange woman. And thus he makes this connection, showing that knowledge fights adultery in this poetic way, which I think is done very well. Well, I mean, actually, it's inspired by God, so it's done perfectly. I take that back. I'll support it. So it says here in verse 3, "For the lips of a strange woman drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech." These metaphors may not apply so well to our current society because of their placement, but I think we can understand that honey is sweet and that oil is smooth. And we can see really that is talking about the flirtatiousness of the adulterer. That sexual immorality, adultery, lust, our whole society is flirtatious. And they're trying to get the young man to do evil. Because adultery seems pleasant. And in a way, it is. It is like honey at times, and it is like oil at times. Because the young man feels loved, appreciated, accomplished. Like this is the greatest thing. Like this is sweet honey to his lips, smoother than oil. The flirtatiousness of the adulteress has now spread to our entire society, and it's dangerous to this young man. And that is why I think we need to study this even more seriously, because how easy it is to fall into lust. I can say that for myself, how easy I have fallen at times into this sin. Maybe not adultery, but lust is, in a sense, adultery. But jumping to verse 4, this beauty of the adulteress is countered by the destruction that follows, that this honey is poisoned, but her end is bitter as wormwood. Wormwood was considered as bitter or poisonous throughout the Bible. Basically, it's a plant that is considered poisonous. I'm not a botanist, so I don't actually know if it actually is poisonous, but back then they considered it poisonous with their knowledge. And then we have a two-edged sword here, and I think the best way to understand that is, first of all, it's incredibly sharp and destructive, but also that it cuts through both body and soul. That there is bodily danger to adultery, that there will be, as we talked about in the Old Testament, there could be death and judgment there. There could also be talking about sexual diseases, which we'll talk about later in a minute, or any of this type of thing, but also it's the soul that is at stake, really. It's this eternal condemnation that is on the one who commits adultery. Because her feet go down to death, her steps take hold of Sheol. The path of the adulteress is the path of death, both temporal and eternal. But then this is countered by verse 6, which I think is so powerful. "Lest she watch the path of life." She is away from the path of life, on the wrong path towards death. "Her tracks are unstable. She does not know it." And in this way, the adulteress is just as blind as the fool who goes towards the adulteress. It is just like Proverbs 1:16-19, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, which says, "For their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. For it is no use that a net is spread in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives." This idea that the adulteress is really condemning herself as well. It's important to understand that the sins of lust, those who are on the other end of the matter, not just you, but the other person, they are also committing iniquity. They will also, in this society, be stoned, and they will also be damned to eternal damnation if repentance does not follow. It is a silly thing to commit adultery, and it is filled with this realization that both parties may not even know the length of the evil they are committing. Yet they will be accountable for that sin. And now we see here that the adulteress is like that of poisoned honey. Sweet, beautiful, wonderful, and at times great to the taster, but really stenched with poison. Poison that will lead to death, both temporal and eternal. This brings us to vignette number 2, the shameful life. Vignette number 2, the shameful life. 7-8, once again, is that command again. "So now, my sons, listen to me, and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house." A command from a father to his son. Run from adultery. Run towards wisdom. And then he provides some reasons of why you should do that. And these reasons are as follows. The first one we have in verse 9 is, you will waste your young life. It says here in verse 9, lest you give your splendor to others and your years to the cruel one. Now, this is one of those verses, and there's a lot of these in Proverbs and in the section we're going to look at, that has many interpretations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you all of those interpretations, then I'm going to give you my interpretation. Option 1 is that this verse, in talking about the cruel one and giving your splendors to others, is talking about slavery. This idea that maybe not only was death on the line, but maybe instead of being killed for adultery, you would be taken into slavery and you would lose your young life and you would be ruled by a cruel master. I don't think that's so. I mean, in the Old Testament, it speaks about stoning of adulterers. It doesn't speak about slavery anywhere. The other option, which I think is an interesting option, is that it is about the adulteress's husband, that she will catch them in the act or maybe after and will kill the person who commits adultery because they've committed adultery they've sinned against somebody's wife and he wants to protect his wife and he'll kill them. This is a possible option. I don't know if that is exactly what's going on here. It could be option 3, that it is the adulteress herself that is the cruel one. However, if you look at the actual diction, it is male diction, not female diction, as the adulteress here is in female. That seems to not really be it either. But I think this is what's correct. It's proverb. And as we looked at Proverbs, in chapter 1, we saw that they're sort of riddles, or as I'll say, broad statements, and can have multiple applications. And I think really the outcome is you'll waste your young life. May it be to the adulteress' husband who comes in and kill you, or the adulteress herself, or whoever it is, or whatever means it is, you will waste your young life. All the things and the goals you had will be lost and thrown away. Whatever means it is, there will be cruel people who will destroy you, and you are giving your splendor to others. When Ecclesiastes talks about casting your bread upon the water, using your talents, your skills, in a generous way to do what is good, this is exactly the opposite of what's going on. He does evil, he commits adultery, he wastes his young life, and he loses everything. And he loses his young years to the cruel one. I think that cruel one can be even seen as adultery itself, that adultery is cruel to the person who commits this sin. It is a devastating destruction that lust is, sexual morality is, and adultery is. Secondly, in verse 10, we will see, you will waste your skills and wealth. Let strangers be satisfied by your strength, and by your painful labor those in the house of a foreigner. Once again, there's different things that this could be meaning, but really I think all boils down to this. Adultery is expensive. And by your painful labor, those in the house of a foreigner, and your strength is lost. And in some other interpretations of the verse, it talks about wealth being lost, your talents, your skill. Going back to Ecclesiastes 11, these skills that have been used for good are used for evil. And in our modern setting, adultery is literally expensive. There's hotels you have to pay for. There's all sorts of things that you could have to hide up. There may even be blackmail involved. Adultery can be expensive and destructive. So not only are you wasting your skills, but you might even be having to do things that are just terrible and wrong. And a waste of your life. It's a shameful life that is wasting your young life. And as this is specifically talking to a young man, I think that's important to take into consideration. That there is so much opportunity for this young man, and he is wasting it away. And verse 11 really builds on this in saying you will waste away and just die in grotesque shame, and you groan at your end when your flesh and your body are consumed. I was going to talk about this earlier. Some people think that this verse is speaking about sexually transmitted diseases. That could be true. I don't think that that is necessarily necessary for that to be true or not be true. Rather, I think it's important to note that at the end of the life of an adulterer, you will be unhappy and you will be in a sort of spiritual destruction. And then you see death knocking on the door, and there is eternal damnation that follows. Looking at Ecclesiastes, we see Solomon in a similar, though different, boat. He found salvation and he repented. However, he still, too, was in this place of groaning, and he felt like his flesh and his body had been consumed, and that he had lost everything, and that it seemed like he had wasted away his life because he did. He wasted his life away. And verses 12 through 13 build on this by saying, maybe in this shameful place you'll call out for wisdom, but it will be too late. And you say, how I have hated discipline, and my heart spurned reproof. I have not listened to the voice of my instructors, and I have not inclined my heart to my teachers. I was almost in utter ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. And in these verses, we just see this young, shameful life, and he calls out for wisdom, and he realizes that he missed his chance. It makes me think back to Proverbs 1, 24 through 32. Because I called and you refused, I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. This is wisdom speaking. And you neglected all my counsel and were not willing to accept my reproof. I will also laugh at your disaster. I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm and your disaster comes like a whirlwind. When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me earnestly, but they will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of Yahweh. They were not willing to accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. So they shall eat the fruit of their way and be satiated with their own devices. For the turning away of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. And it gets even worse, it seems, in verse 14, which I think is one of the most crushing verses in this section about the shameful life. I was almost in utter ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. Basically, what it's saying here is the church or whatever society or community that you're a part of will find you out eventually, and there will be shame. There are many stories of people who have come to churches and they have confessed their sins, and they were shamed, and they felt this destruction in their life and a feeling of utter ruin. This is a shameful life to run after adultery, sexual immorality, and lust. And what I want to make clear in this section is that yes, adultery leads to eternal damnation, but Proverbs speaks, and a lot of these wisdom languages speak about the present time, of the now. And he's not talking about in eternity, in hell, you'll experience these things. No, he's saying now. That if you commit adultery, you're wasting your young life away, and when you are older, you will regret it. You will feel filled with shame. Your friends will forsake you. You will fall into utter ruin, and you'll have a life of shame. I think for the young man, me particularly, looking forward to that future full of shame and destruction makes me want to run farther and farther from lust that leads to, and is in a similar way, adultery. This leads us to vignette number 3, which I will call God-given beauty. This is, I would say, one of the most beautiful passages in this section, so I'm just going to read it again and try to really emphasize the poetic language that is used here to express something so beautiful about marriage. Drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for you alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountains be blessed, and be glad in the wife of your youth. As a loving hind in a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be intoxicated always with her love. So why should you, my son, be intoxicated with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a foreign woman? For the ways of a man are before the eyes of Yahweh, and he watches all his tracks. His own iniquities will capture him, who is the wicked one. And with the cords of his sin he will be held fast. He will die for lack of discipline, and the abundance of his folly he will stumble in intoxication. Note here, firstly, how Solomon portrays the beauty of rightful sexuality. And he uses that rightful, beautiful sexuality as a contrast to adultery. He says here very clearly in these texts, in this beautiful portrayal of what sexual life should be between a man and a woman. And he says that it is to love your wife and your wife alone, and love her well. And by this, adultery can be fought. And adultery can be pushed to the side. Why would you even want adultery? It says that at the end. Why would you even want adultery if you have a beautiful, loving relationship? Why would you even want that? And now it's important to note that sexual intercourse itself is not the entirety of marriage. Rather, it's the love of the entire relationship. That's talked about many places in the Bible, that whole relationship, every part of it is about this love. And that whole love fights against adultery. But it is specifically talking about sexual intercourse. 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5, Paul talks about this. 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of sexual immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. It's a very interesting passage, and it seems like it shouldn't fit in the Christian religion. I mean, how can we even talk about these things? Well, it's this. It's that it says in Genesis very clearly, be fruitful and multiply. But then God has put it in there in that it's this beautiful display of sexual passion in addition. It's a gift from God that is done wrongly in adultery. But it's important for the Christian to understand that love and this epitome of love is right. And it is something that should be done. I mean, it's talked about in Genesis before the fall. It says, be fruitful and multiply. But once again, I come back to my caveat that is not the whole of the marriage between a man and woman, obviously. But I'm not married. And I think that's very important to note. And obviously, I'm not married. And I want to note that. And maybe you're listening to this and you're not married. Or maybe you are married and you're going, Jason, you have no idea what you're talking about. Sure. Feel free, because I honestly don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just looking at the text and trying to get out of it. So what does this mean, and what does this whole passage mean to somebody who's not married? Well, I think it's this. It's that if you have a rightful view of marriage now that contrasts that of the world, because the world says, who cares about marriage? Marriage is something that is totally revolved around sexual intercourse, around that love when you find that person. And when that breaks, then, move on. That's wrong. Marriage is not that. It's a loving relationship over a long period of time through the good and the bad that happens to have at the earlier stages and being fruitful and multiply sexual intercourse. That's not the whole of it. So if we have a right view of marriage now that contrasts that of the world, then we can contrast and fight against everything else that they're throwing at us. And we can wait for marriage. We can prepare for marriage. We can, in a sense, save ourselves for marriage. And then when we are married, we will be able to fight adultery even better. And I think that is why this text is so important, because this text, once again, is not said to somebody who has been in a marriage for a long time. It's not clear if Rehoboam was in a marriage. I don't know. However, he probably wasn't married for a long time. It even says here, in the woman of your youth. They weren't married even for that long time. And I think the point is to look forward to these things. Look forward to these things so that you may fight them now as the young man. And I think that is so important in our society, especially in society that pushes marriage towards a later date in time. So may we be able to fight adultery, lust, and all sexual morality by having a rightful view of marriage, seeing that it's a beautiful thing in the future that we can look forward to. And then we see verses 20 through 23 make it very clear that why would we go down the path of adultery? Why would we go down the path of sin? Why would we go down the path of damnation when the gift of marriage is available? May we be intoxicated with this idea of beautiful marriage that is a symbol of Christ's love for the church and the church's love for Christ. And may we run from adultery. In conclusion of these 3 vignettes, I want to say this. As I've spoken before, Solomon failed. He wrote these things and he fell short. Rehoboam, too, who listened to these things, fell short. And he did not repent, and he fell even farther short than Solomon did, not committing as much sin as Solomon did, but not repenting. It says here in 2 Chronicles 11, 18 through 21, then Rehoboam took as a wife Mahaleth, the daughter of Jerimoth, the son of David, and of Abihail, the daughter of Eliab, the son of Jesse. And she bore him sons, Jehush, Shemaiah, and Zaham. And after her he took Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, and she bore him Abishai, Attai, Ziza, and Shelomith. And Rehoboam loved Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, more than all his other wives and concubines, for he had taken 18 wives and 60 concubines and became the father of 28 sons and 60 daughters. Obviously, if he was in competition with his father, he lost. However, that's not the point. The point is that he too committed adultery. He too did not listen to these things. So why are we even trying? Well, I don't think that's the question. I think it's rather, this is how dangerous this is. Keep trying. Keep fighting. Because it's so easy to fall into sin. Maybe you've fallen into it already. I know I've fallen into lust. I know I've fallen there. So I think reading this, I know that I need to fight harder against adultery, fight harder against lust and sexual immorality, flee sexual immorality. And I'll end with this verse. This was a powerful verse that was shared with me. 2 Timothy 2:22. Now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Adultery, lust, sexual morality, it's wrong, it's evil, it's an abhorrence in the eyes of God. It's sinful, it leads to temporal destruction and eternal destruction. Flee these things, these youthful things, these almost silly things, and let's pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.